Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Ian Ruxton here once more. This time talking about Sir Ernest Satow at The Hague in 1907, based on a PowerPoint which I created for a talk at the British International History Group conference at Exeter University in 2018. And you can see Sir Ernest there on the left side in a group photo at The Hague, which we will see again later. All right, off we go. So here's my introduction. Sir Ernest Satow retired after a distinguished diplomatic career in Japan, China, Siam, Thailand, Uruguay, and Morocco on October the 26th, 1906. He began to live in Ottery St Mary, a small town in Devon, early in 1907, in southwest England, that is. He attended the Second Hague Peace Conference from June to October 1907 as the second member of the British delegation, which also included Sir Edward Fry, Lord Reay, and Sir Henry Howard as fellow delegates plenipotentiary. Fry and Reay became Satow's close friends after the conference. Including military, naval, and technical delegates and 2 secretaries, the delegation comprised 13 members as follows. So the delegates, the first one was Sir Edward Fry, then Sir Ernest Satow, Lord Reay, and Sir Henry Howard. The military delegates, Sir Edmund Ellis, or Els, I'm not quite sure about pronunciation of his family name. The naval delegate, Captain C.L. Otley. The technical delegates, Eyre Crowe, First Secretary, Cecil Hurst, Legal Advisor, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Yard Buller, Commander J.R. Segrave and Major George K. Cockerill, and the Assistant Secretaries were Charles Tufton and Joseph Addison. And here are the 3 other delegates with Satow, who were with Satow: Sir Edward Fry, the oldest, Lord Reay, and Sir Henry Howard. Reay was in fact the head of the Reay clan, although he was Dutch born. And Sir Henry Howard was also a diplomat. Eyre Crowe, here he is. There are only 2 insider accounts of Britain's role at the 1907 Hague Conference, Satow's and Crowe's. Crowe, aged 43, badgered the elderly Fry to initiate daily staff conferences, etc. Crowe had good French, Fry did not. The 80-year-old Fry, who was a Quaker, was concerned about armament limitation. Reay, aged 68 at the time, was anguished by the arms race. He was a radical and a critic of Edward Grey's foreign policy as excessively anti-German. Crowe was disappointed that he could not persuade Satow, who was then aged 64, to follow the official Foreign Office line. He thought Satow followed Reay weakly, but Satow himself was a secret critic of his Foreign Office masters. This material comes mainly from Nigel Brayley's paper, which I mention, or I cite, sorry, at the end of this presentation. Background. Crowe was a senior clerk in the Western Department of the Foreign Office, and in January 1907, he produced an unsolicited memorandum on the present state of British relations with France and Germany, which described Germany as a threat and a blackmailer. Grey said he found Crowe's memorandum most valuable. So perhaps we can say that Crowe was a rising star in the Foreign Office. Satow's diaries were a private record, not expected to be read for years, although they have been recently, of course. And they are much more detailed than Eyre Crowe's reports as secretary to the delegation to William Tyrrell, Sir Edward Grey's private secretary. More than the anticipated issues of disarmament or the formation of a proto-League of Nations, the key issue at the conference was the maritime warfare implications of the recent Russo-Japanese War, which Satow had observed from his Peking or Beijing post. So you could say it was right up his street, so to speak. Satow's diary doesn't mention Crowe much in the early stages. He was involved in the 3rd and 4th commissions, and Crowe mainly involved in the 1st. Okay, so as regards the structure of the 1907 Hague Conference, it was divided into 4 commissions as follows. The first dealt with improvements in the 1899 Hague Convention relating to Pacific settlement of disputes, international commissions of inquiry, and maritime prizes. The second was concerned with involvements in the in the convention respecting law and customs of war on land, declarations of 1899, rights and duties of neutrals on land, and the opening of hostilities. The third was concerned with bombardments of ports, towns, and villages by a naval force, the laying of torpedoes, etc., and regulations for ships of belligerents in neutral ports, and additions to the 1899 Convention to adapt principles of the Geneva Convention of 1866, revised in 1906, to maritime warfare. And the fourth, of which Satow was a vice president, was concerned with conversion of merchant ships into warships, private property at sea, days of grace to depart an enemy's port, contraband of war, blockade, destruction of neutral prizes by force majeure, applying land warfare provisions to naval warfare. Okay, now I'm going to give you selections of Satow's diaries. On the 21st of May, went to Fayland House, 8 miles by road from Bristol, to see Sir Edward Fry and discuss various subjects connected with the Hague Conference. We read to each other what we had written and found ourselves in complete accord. On the 3rd of June, there was levee, then lunched with the Riets. Sir Edward Fry was there. There was a conference at the Foreign Office, presided over by Sir Edward Fry, to discuss our instructions, in which Sir Edward Fry and I obtained some modifications. The Cabinet has decided not to abandon the right of capturing belligerent ships and cargoes, but do not desire to shut the door completely. He is to draft our instructions on that point and submit them to the Cabinet. Also, the instructions about the limitation of armaments are to be drafted after he has seen Choate, who is now in London. That's Joseph Hodges Choate, an American lawyer and diplomat and head of the US delegation at the Second Hague Conference. 10th of June, came up to town by the 12:12 train, that is, came up to London town by the 12:12 train and went at once to the postponed discussions of our instructions at the Foreign Office. Difficulties presented themselves in connection with the proposed appeal to the International Court from the prize courts of belligerents. Afterwards, the 3 delegates and Sir Edward Grey had a conversation with Professor Renaud, and we told him the main points in our instructions. The French delegates are instructed to maintain the right of capture at sea of belligerent ships and cargoes. So Louis Renaud was a French jurist and educator. He was co-winner in 1907 with Ernesto Moneta of the Nobel Peace Prize, and he was a French delegate at The Hague in 1899 and 1907. So now we get the conference underway. 15th of June, 3 p.m., the first meeting of the conference in the Ridderzaal in the Binnenhof, after which tea and cakes were served to the ladies and others in a room upstairs. We came back to the hotel with the French delegation and had a long talk about abolition of contraband and the creation of a court of appeal from prize courts. Bourgeois and Renaud, I don't know why there's an acute accent, but anyway, Bourgeois and Renaud did not think this was practicable. When they had gone, I had a talk with Suzuki and gave a note of what he said to Sir Edward Fry. So here are some notes, footnotes, in fact, from my published edition of the diaries. The Second Hague Peace Conference began on the 15th of June and ended on the 18th of October 1907. It produced 13 separate conventions, of which 12 were ratified and entered into force, and also one declaration. The Binnenhof is a complex of buildings in the center of The Hague next to, excuse my pronunciation, Hofvijver, I suppose, Hofvijver Lake. It comprises the Dutch Parliament, the office of the Prime Minister, and the Ridderzaal, with the throne of the monarchs of the Netherlands. And Suzuki Keiroku was a Japanese government official and diplomat. He studied at Berlin and France, and he was a Japanese delegate at The Hague in 1907. So here is a photograph of a plenary session at the Hague Conference, possibly the first one. And Satow is seated just to the right of center, right here. If you follow, you can see my cursor there. There he is. Okay. And this is the close-up again. The ladies were all on the balcony looking down, because I think there were no female delegates at all. Such was the era. Okay, continuing with the diaries. On the 17th of June, this morning, we had a discussion in the presence of the whole staff of Tonieli's private proposal to modify the right of capture of enemy ships and cargoes by sequestration during the period of war. Otley read a memorandum against it, and Hurst another, in which he concluded on the whole unfavorably. It was finally decided to inform the Foreign Office of the proposal and to say that we opposed it and should take that line in conference unless we received definite instructions to the contrary. 22nd of June, I went to Tonieli about the division of the Third Commission into 2 sub-commissions. He has already fixed in his own mind who is to preside over them, himself and Hagerup, and also the secretaries and rapporteur. 24th of June, first sitting of the Third Commission under Tonieli, the commission of which Satow was vice president. Hagerup becomes president of the subcommittee on bombardment of open towns and floating mines. In the afternoon, the Fourth Commission met under de Martins. Count Tonieli was head of the Italian legation. 28th of June, after the usual morning sitting of the delegation, which kept us till 12:45, we went down to Choate's room and had a long wrangle with the whole of the Americans about our proposed definition of a warship and fleet auxiliary, Choate maintaining that we were claiming a right to sink a neutral vessel carrying contraband, while at the same time we proposed to abolish contraband, and that they could not give up the right to have their ships brought before a prize court. Sir Edward, rather injudiciously as I thought, proposed to treat such cases as exceptions to the abolition of contraband and to bring them in. Otley insisted on unneutral service. July the 1st, the first delegates had an audience of the Queen at noon, and the garden party at the Haus ten Bosch was given up on account of the damp, cold weather, an evening reception at the Noordeinde Palace being substituted. The delegations were assembled in a large saloon. And there we are. Queen Wilhelmina was Queen of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, 1890 to 1948. These are, of course, very rather technical discussions, a little bit difficult to follow, especially as noted in Satow's diary, unless you are particularly a specialist in this area. But I dare say that some people watching this might be. 16th of July morning, plenary meeting of the Third Commission to discuss the report of the subcommittee on application of the Geneva Convention of July 1906 to the principles of maritime warfare, and a small committee appointed to frame a synopsis of the proposals as to treatment of belligerent warships in neutral ports. 18th of July, bombardment of open towns, etc., resumed this afternoon. Otley criticized certain of Tornielli's proposals, which made the old gentleman very angry. Finally, it was referred to a comité de rédaction, drafting committee. 19th of July, this afternoon, there was a meeting of the Fourth Commission at which the Brazilian and Belgian proposal, amended by the Dutch, regarding private property were finally got rid of. Probably proposals, I suppose. And bourgeois were to recommend that governments should abolish prize money and indemnify losers by private capture was first put off for a fortnight. De Martin's proposal that at the outset of the war, governments should declare what course they would pursue with regard to belligerent private property met with so little favor that he withdrew it, probably by direction of his chief. Rie then read his explanation of our definition of fleet auxiliaries, very good argument which gave rise to some discussion, and it was referred at Tornielli's suggestion to a small committee. 20th of July, plenary meeting to pass the convention about application of the principles of the Geneva Convention to maritime warfare, the first piece of work accomplished by the conference. On we go. July 23rd, went to the arbitration committee in the afternoon, a series of speeches on the Drago doctrine by South American delegates, including a long and tedious sermon by Muy Verbosa and a longish one by Marshall. Telegram from Foreign Office authorizing us to join the US in their General Arbitration Treaty proposals, adding our formula for limiting its application. From a letter received by Rie from Fitzmaurice, it is clear that Soveral has been talking to the King, Fitzmaurice and Edward Grey, who have listened to him when our written representations have had no effect. We resolved this morning that Hurst and Otley should go over to London to put the authorities right as to certain of our recommendations. So here are some footnotes again. Rui Barbosa of Brazil was nicknamed Muy Verbosa, which is Spanish for very verbose, by one of the British delegates, possibly Satow, and the conference killer by others. Baron Marshal von Bieberstein was the first German delegate. Marquess Luis Pinto de Soveral was Portuguese ambassador extraordinary to the Hague Conference. And Edward Fitzmaurice, first Baron Fitzmaurice, was the Under Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs from 1905 to 1908. On. 1st of August, afternoon continuation of the discussion of Louis Renault's questionnaire, or questionnaire, I suppose in French, regarding treatment of belligerent war vessels in neutral ports and rights and duties of neutrals. I read a long speech on the necessity of agreement among the powers as to the 24 hours rule and limits to be placed on supplies of coal and provisions. Cherikov followed with his views that no agreement should be made. Finally, the whole was referred to Comité d'Examen. 8th of August, Sir Edward Fry showed Rie and myself certain proposals of de Martin's about transformation of ships on the open sea, which, if accepted, would tear up the Dardanelles Treaty with certain amendments of his own that would refuse Russian volunteer steamers the right to pass through the Bosporus. My opinion is that the less he discusses such a question with the tricky de Martins, the better. So Nikolai Cherikov was a Russian delegate, so was Fyodor Martins, and the Dardanelles Treaty of 1809 was between the United Kingdom and the Ottoman Empire. It affirmed the principle that no warships of any power should enter the Straits of the Dardanelles. That's the straits between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Fifth of September, from 2:30 till past 6, fighting in Tornielli's subcommission over coaling, rights of neutrals to forbid the access of the ports, etc., to belligerents, internment of warships. Suzuki's Article 26. In the morning, Cherikov had been to see me about all these points, and I had refused to give way, at which he was very annoyed. After we had carried out our coaling proposal by 8 to proposal by 8 to 5. Ziegel proposed his, which was carried by 10 to 5, as Denmark and Norway deserted us. We in the committee also discussed the preamble, to which I made objections on various grounds and proposed a much shorter one. Finally, it was agreed that Tonieli, Renaud, Charikov, and I should meet to frame the preamble. 7th of September, forenoon, a plenary sitting of the conference to receive Renaud's report on the declaration of hostilities and Colonel Borrell's 2 reports on rights and duties of neutrals in land warfare and positions of neutrals residing in belligerent territory. On a paragraph in an article of the latter, there had been sharp opposition in the committee. Germany wanted neutrals to be entirely exempted from military service. The Belgians and ourselves, on behalf of colonies, desired to reserve the right to make them serve. Voting had been 12 to 9 with 13 abstentions. Marshall got up and made a speech condemning the draft projet, which had resulted from this voting, and eventually proposed to send back the latter part to the Commission, but prompted by Krieger, he asked that the whole should go back. This was submitted to the conference and agreed to by all but 3, amongst whom was Choate. Great excitement and reaction ensued. The general impression was that to bring before the conference a projet which had so little support, relatively, was a mistake. And Ziegel was Rear Admiral Ziegel of the German delegation. And the 19th of September, I learned from Otley that it was decided yesterday to telegraph to the Foreign Office recommending that continuous voyage should be surrendered to the Germans in connection with blockade as far as cargo is concerned, but not as regards ships. Krieger, having intimated his readiness to ask his people to agree to the zone of 800 miles for blockade. This was done without my being told. I am more convinced than ever that contraband and blockade being thus linked together, the 2 subjects ought to be dealt with by one man, and that I desire to be relieved of all responsibility in regard to blockade, and I have stated my opinion to the rest of the delegation. Crowe had a conversation with Renaud from which he draws the conclusion that France would be willing to join in a small conference for the discussion of contraband and blockade next spring, and that consequently both questions should now be dropped. If this were done, Sir Edward Fry tells me the conference could be wound up by the first days of October. 26th of September at 2 o'clock, mines presided over by Tonieli. Triana made his motion to restrict the use of mines to defensive purposes, which was combated by the Austro-Hungarian delegate Mire and Hagerup, who said he would reserve his vote. Marshall agreed with Mire. I supported it on the ground that we favored every proposal tending to restrict the use of mines. 15 voted for and 16 against, and there were a few abstentions. Otley wanted to get up and talk, and then when I refused to let him open his mouth, wished me to reply to Marshall, which I refused to do. I had a passage of arms with Hagerup over the article prohibiting use of mines for the mere purpose of intercepting commerce, and he having said that I had spoken of des petits états, small states, I corrected him and repeated that my word had been puissance, powers. I did not recognize any difference between great and small at the conference. Finally, the projet got itself voted unanimously, on which I got up and made a compliment to Tonieli and the technical delegates who had worked on the examining committee. "30th of September, Charikov came to me with a proposal that in exchange for our agreeing to Swedish delegate Knut Hammarskjöld's wording of Article 12 of Rights and Duties of Neutrals, they should get Germany to vote paragraph 1 of Article 1 on mines. I told him that was not nearly enough. We must have Article 6 amended to suit us, get Germany's vote for Article 2, and insert an article prohibiting the laying of mines in the open sea. He demurred to the last, but drafted a new wording of Article 6, which would prohibit the use of any not perfected mines, and took it away. When he had gone, Sir Edward Fry, Crowe, and Howard and I discussed the question, Hurst being absent at the Comité de Rédaction, and we came to the conclusion that we might perhaps agree if we got all we wanted. I had, of course, told Charikov that even in that case, we should not hold ourselves bound to accept the Convention on R&D of Neutrals, that's rights and duties of neutrals, nor to refrain from expressing our dissatisfaction with the Mines Convention. On the 3rd of October, I held a meeting of our delegation this morning to approve dropping the deal with the Russian and draft of a letter to Charikov informing him. We also discussed the effect of various conventions in case either a belligerent or a neutral was not a party, particularly the case of the transformation of a warship on the high seas. I showed the draft to Suzuki, who was greatly pleased and lent me the speech he intends to make on the subject of coaling, etc. Then I went to tell Tornielli that he might call a meeting, as far as we are concerned, as soon as possible. He was much annoyed and came across after lunch to express his annoyance to Sir Edward, who would not admit that we were to blame. 9th of October, morning séance plénière, plenary session, at which the emasculated draft convention about mines was voted, and then I made our speech condemning it as insufficient. Much applause. Marshall got up and in a rude tone declared that Germany was as humane as any other power. He got very little applause. After the meeting was over, I said to him, "I hope you were not annoyed by anything I said." He replied, "No, my remarks were in reply to your press, and above all to my friend Saunders." That's the Time correspondent, George Saunders. 16th of October, meeting of the conference, which lasted nearly 3 hours, to pass the projet for a permanent court of arbitral justice and bury the general treaty of obligatory arbitration, after which Renaud gave an account of the work of the Comité de Rédaction in his usual luminous style. Bourgeois received many compliments on his conduct of the First Commission, even from Marshall, who, however, seemed to speak against the grain. On the 17th of October, at 5 to the last plenary session, which passed off without a hitch. Only the irrepressible Swiss delegate Carlin declared that he would sign the acte final with a reserve as to the mention in it of the draft scheme for a Cour de Justice arbitral. Sir Edward gave us all a dinner at the Restaurant Van der Pijl, and Addison, being the youngest of the delegation, proposed his health in a humorous speech. 19th of October, after a rough crossing, got to Harwich on the English coast a little before 7. So here are some concluding remarks. Satow played an important role within the British delegation as a counterbalance to young Crowe, who energetically represented the views of his superiors at the Foreign Office and attempted to manage the whole delegation. The third and fourth commissions were concerned with naval warfare, the centerpiece of the conference, and Satow was involved with both of these. He paid attention in his diary to the concerns expressed by delegates of small countries. I think also it should be mentioned that Satow wrote on topics of concern with naval warfare, contraband, and so on later on. So this conference, in a sense, may have provided a stimulus for his career as an international lawyer. The most important product of the conference, or result of the conference, for which Satow was substantially responsible, as he wrote in a letter to Aston on the 6th of February 1909, was the London Naval Conference of December 1908 to February 1909. A stomach operation prevented Satow from attending the latter, except for the post-conference dinner on the 8th of February 1909. And here are my sources, the primary sources: James Brown Scott, Satow Papers and Diaries, my book of his diaries published, the Avalon Project of Yale Law School, and then a couple of papers that I found useful. Thomas Otte on the Crowe-Satow correspondence, and Nigel Brayley, the late Nigel Brayley, Sir Ernest Satow, and the 1907 Second Hague Peace Conference in Diplomacy and Statecraft, volume 13, number 2, 2002, pages 201 to 228. And that is all I have to say on this topic. Thank you very much for listening, if you have been, and goodbye for now.